Thank you, everyone. It's really good to be here. It's always good to be home in Houston, in the Houston area, where I was born and raised. My family goes back several generations in Southeast Texas and in the Texas border region. So again, it's always good to be home. It was -5 when I left Minneapolis yesterday. So I know you think it's cold, but this is like spring to me right now, so I'm enjoying it. Thank you, everyone. Thank Dr. Thais. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Juan, Dr. Juan Galvan, for piecing this together. We went to grad school together at the University of Houston for a little while, and I remember the rich debates and ongoing conversations that we've had. So that all contributed, I think, to what came to be this book. So it's great to share this with you. As I wrote my book, Raza, Migra, here's a image of the cover. The ground on which immigration was debated and struggled over shifted under my feet. It was challenging to write about a topic that's often at the center of intense debate, but also realized studying the past to understand the present was extremely useful, especially given the emotionally labor-intensive and rapidly changing contemporary events that are ongoing in regards to immigration policy. Today we see this as the current administration has taken the steps of deportation from the past administrations to overtly separate children from their parents and families. Right, more than 2,800 children have been affected by that policy. Both this is particularly upsetting and simultaneously the latest kind of human rights atrocity put into practice in a longer history of what Amiri Baraka calls the changing same. To study the history of the system and resistances put together by those most affected by them is of prime importance to me, to put, as one theorist put it, understand the limits of power and the character of those limits. The book itself documents the ways in which an expanding immigration system evoked violence on Mexican origin and Latino origin communities to create a situation where solidarity was forged between Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants within what we call the Chicano movement, the Mexican American contingent of the civil rights movement. Coming to forge a politics that I call Raza si, Migra no, Mexican American activists conceptualized undocumented migrants as members of their community, as members of the Chicano Mexicano community, as they put it. Part of this involved identifying La Migra, the Border Patrol, and immigration policing mechanisms as harmful to their communities, which led to a call to abolish the organization, to abolish the Border Patrol, which I want to center that interesting idea that emerges through struggle through the 1970s. I've done a few talks in the past year, and recently actually in the past few weeks, and two key premises emerged that I think are very important that I learned from doing this research. One, the Border Patrol, or now as we know the ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, as an institution does not do what it publicly states its purpose is, which is to maintain safety. Much rather, it works as a control mechanism over a subordinated workforce. And we can unpack this, and I'd love to hear Q&A and feedback. Two, the fear-mongering about so-called open borders is a farce. We already have open borders because capitalism, our economy, demands that we have open borders to access labor and to allow businesses to move across borders throughout the world. So the question to me is not really whether we want open borders or not. The question to me is really about what kind of open border policy do we want? These movements, as I'll explore, asserted that the one we have now produces violence against working class, primarily Mexican and Latino communities. As current cause, last summer after the book, a few months after the book came out, again, a key kind of assertion of the book is how these activists came to a position to call for the abolition of the Border Patrol. Right? What did they go through? How did they debate to come to that point, right? And interestingly, just a few months after the book came out, this new movement, #AbolishICE, emerged last summer. So I think it's interesting to start the talk by considering where there's overlap with this movement currently and this movement in the 70s, and where there's differentiation. Browsing the current calls to abolish ICE reveal all kinds of ideas about, and I think it's still in development and we don't know exactly what that means, but we have some ideas. On the one hand, it appears it's referencing that ICE is a young entity in its recent emergence after 9/11 that can be, because it's recent, it can be more easily done away with. As historian Elliot Young writes, though, the issue with this is that despite the name of the latest bureaucratic entity in charge of immigration policing, it's for more than 100 years has targeted communities of color for expulsion and dehumanization. Again, as I'll discuss, the movement for immigrant rights and the Chicano movement struggled to tie this regime to the longer history of oppression of Mexican origin peoples, beginning with the Mexican-American War in the 19th century. Reallocating who does the policing will do little to unravel this long history of creating rightless people through immigration policy. Here's a quick kind of comparison. Here's some things that overlap, I think, between what I call Raza si Migra no politics that emerged in the civil rights era and the current call to abolish ICE. Both see violence against migrant communities as inherent to immigration policy. That's why the call to abolish it, right? Both recognize ties to the Black freedom movement, the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, and policing regimes more broadly. I'll share some examples of that. Abolish ICE, what's different about Abolish ICE, I think it's more overtly tied to feminist and queer struggle. You have LGBT immigrant folks and women-centered ideas about immigration leading it, right? It's also led by undocumented folks. As I'll share, the movement, of course, included undocumented people, but many of the leaders were US born. It's also multi-ethnic. It's thinking in terms of immigrants from other places as well. The Chicano movement, however, was more specific to the ways that immigration was deeply rooted in specifically anti-Mexican sentiment and that history. And the movement was more focused on the functioning of the immigration system as creating a labor system, an exploitative labor system, that Abolish ICE hasn't quite articulated the same way. So those are some similarities, some overlap. I'll jump into some examples and some overview of the book now. I take the notion of abolishing the Border Patrol as it relates to struggles for Mexican-American civil rights to give a brief narrative of some key moments in the book that contributed to the development of that concept. I hope it might be useful in understanding this important moment from the past and contribute again to our continued battle with the immigration regime in the present. This is the contents. It's primarily focused on post-1968 and 1986, although there is kind of a background chapter that looks way back in the 1920s and 30s and finds roots of this kind of politics way back then in the labor movement. The first kind of mention of abolition in the context of Mexican-American civil rights comes actually from a Tejana, a Texas-Mexican woman named Emma Tenayuca, who was from San Antonio. She said it is only recently, in 1938, that the growth of the labor movement among Mexican people, that a correct program has developed calling for the abolition of all restrictions, economic, political, and cultural, and for due recognition of the historic rights of the Mexican people in the territory. So many iterations of this perspective look back to the initial way that Mexicans became part of the United States, which was through conquest, right? And that's what she's referring to in terms of historical rights. The Chicano movement, by the late 60s, ends up engaging the immigration system due to violence. This is what put it on their radar. They weren't necessarily thinking about immigration. They were thinking about the war in Vietnam. They were thinking about voting rights. They were thinking about a number of other things. But the experience of migration and the experience of violence from the Border Patrol and other entities led them to kind of be forced to face this issue. And so I'm forewarning, there's some violent content that I'll be sharing, but I think it's important, particularly because these communities address these violent moments in an attempt to stop them, right? They express their agency in terms of trying to handle to address the injustice of it. So in 1971-72, a string of kind of violent incidents occurred that brought many Mexican-American organizations to address this issue. And here's some examples. Antonio Cuevas claimed he was beaten twice in the same day, crossing to Mexico from San Diego and back to the United States. Both times he was assaulted. He happened to be Mexican-American. He was a U.S. citizen. The same year, Antolin Gutierrez Morfin, an undocumented migrant, was run over twice by a Border Patrol vehicle and severely injured. Temporary legal resident Carlos Basabe Mayoral, who served in the U.S. military in Vietnam, was deported and stripped of his I-51 permit on charges of smuggling marijuana, only to be reinstated when the charges against him were dropped. And disturbingly, as this headline shares, Martha Elena Para Lopez was sexually assaulted by a Border Patrol agent before she was deported. After this incident, she came forward. I have a whole chapter on her testimony, trying to keep the agent accountable for his actions. And after that, up to 500 women came forward complaining of unjustified strip searches by the Border Patrol, leading to a federal hearing in 1972. In San Diego, of course, which is 15 miles from the border, where I center the study, a memorandum from the sheriff of San Diego County, John Duffy, asked taxi cab drivers to pick up persons or groups of persons whom they feel look illegal, and that they should notify the police immediately under threat of losing their permits and getting fined. So all these things happen within a 19-month period or so. And so the movement seeks to address these issues because obviously they're causing all these problems. One site they do that in is an organization called CASA. CASA stands for the Center for Autonomous Social Action. It was first founded in Los Angeles. And it was a site in which Mexican-American activists gave legal and social services to immigrants that needed them. One, to address their needs and their survival, and two, to politicize them and have them join the movement. So here's a flyer from the San Diego chapter of CASA. This place was very important because for Mexican-American activists, they learned more from immigrants themselves, the struggles of being a migrant in the border region, and infuse that into their political agendas. So I interviewed several of folks who were part of this movement. Here's one image of Norma Mena Cáceres, who Mexican-American women in particular helped run this agency and this organization. And she's in front of Casa Justicia, which is the CASA office where migrants would go to get services, which sat next door to Aztec Printing, which was a business organization that activist Herman Baca ran. One story they told me, when you would become a member of CASA, when an immigrant would become a member of CASA, you'd pay dues to be in the organization and you'd get legal and social services to help. They would get a card that showed they were a member, and the card happened to be green. One day, the Border Patrol pulls up in its truck to the offices here and tries to get them to explain to their member that it's not an official green card. He thought he could go back and forth with the green card just because it was green, right? And he mistakenly thought that he could do that. And they had to explain to him, we're working on your legal case, like don't do that anymore so we can try to get you legal standing. But to me, that shows the safety and the usefulness that this place was for migrants. Another key site in which these ideas were developed was the La Raza Unida Party, which was a third-party effort, an ethnic third-party effort that actually emerged in South Texas here in Crystal City. There was a San Diego chapter, and it was a site, their newsletter, as pictured here, was a site of consciousness raising about the immigration issue. It was also a site where they thought through their ideas and debated and analyzed why they were coming up against these violent kind of incidents. And it's in this space where they first articulated in 1972 their ideas about abolishing the Border Patrol. Right? So one part of the debate says, visas, they calls for visas for all persons in the U.S., no more deportations, repeals of discriminatory anti-Asian immigration quota laws, and a complete overhaul of the Border Patrol and Immigration Service. Another one says they demand that existing law enforcement agencies in general that have placed Chicanos in a second-class citizenship be replaced by institutions controlled by the Chicano community itself. Many of them, again, reference the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 that was signed with Mexico after more than a third of Mexico's land was appropriated by the United States, and about 100,000 Mexicans became part of the United States. They said the treaty said that it gives right of full citizenship to all Mexicanos, right, to all Mexicans. They argued that it guaranteed in the treaty for Mexicans who chose to stay in the U.S., including, from their perspective, so-called illegal aliens, who were part of our people, easy entry into the U.S. at any time. So the basis in the treaty led again to the first civil rights era call to abolish the Border Patrol. In essence, the argument claimed that the Border Patrol system violated the treaty since it denied the civil rights guaranteed by the treaty to Mexicans in the United States through quote-unquote undue harassment, and again extended to also police, sheriff, and other agencies who wreak violence against our people, as they put it. So this was a very important site in which they worked these ideas out in the early 1970s. Continued engagement with violence of law enforcement bolstered their arguments about abolition, showing the intersections of local policing with border policing. Right? In San Diego, this was very common. And in 1975, a young man named Tato Rivera was shot in the back by a police officer in the National City suburb where these activists lived. So this is an image from the Justice for Tato Rivera, Justice for Luis Tato Rivera movement that happened there. After the shooting, they attempted to recall the entire city council there. Important about this situation was that it brought him in contact with a Black Power organization called NIA. This is an image of a NIA demonstration. NIA was related to the African American organization US, which the leader of US, Maulana Karenga, of course, invented Kwanzaa, right? So this was a new dialogue that emerged between black folks and brown folks, basically. And I think this contributed to the idea of abolition, right? Because when we think of abolition, we think of the slave system, right? And they were making parallels and dialoguing about this. Bringing them even closer to NIA was the horrific event of the Ku Klux Klan announcing in 1977 that they would help the Border Patrol apprehend Mexican immigrants. An individual named David Duke, who, when I was young, actually ran for governor of Louisiana, and more recently has been tied to the president and his support for the president, right? So he's still around. Interestingly, he was the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan at this time, and made this announcement. Of course, this led for a number of activists of color in the San Diego region to react and demand that the KKK remove itself, right? Interestingly, they tied the obvious racism of a group like the Klan with the more implicit racism they argued that was at the basis of immigration policy, policing the Mexican border in particular. Again, this also led to tighter bonds with NIA and other communities of color in San Diego. There was an incident of a cross burning in the yard of the first African American council member in San Diego, Leon Williams. Herman Baca, again, the leader of the Committee on Chicano Rights at this time, his home was vandalized. They spray painted, I think, in his front wall of his house to go back to Mexico. He said him and his friends patrolled his home and his block for the next week before they were going to have a unity march to make sure that there wasn't any violence taking place. There's some images of some of the leaders of NIA and some of the leaders of the Chicano movement meeting to address this issue. Herman Baca, pictured on your left, said, on October 29th, 1977, the community joined by Chicano leaders from throughout the nation marched to demonstrate their anger and ran the KKK out of the Chicano community. But the threat posed by the immigration crisis still exists, he argued. 15 million Chicano, Latino, Mexicanos in the U.S. must now understand that the immigration proposal is in fact a loaded gun pointed at our heads. Right? They used, again, the overt racism of the Klan to tie it to the implicit racism they argued was part of immigration policy. This was specifically tied to President Jimmy Carter's new immigration proposal he proposed just months before that Klan incident in 1977. Even though, of course, Carter was a liberal Democrat, he was elected by a lot of minority support, particularly the Latino community. He introduced a proposal that would further militarize the U.S.-Mexico border, alongside give amnesty, have a guest worker program, and some other things. But the Latino community in particular was particularly upset about his decision to militarize the border further, especially after all of the violent incidents that had occurred. So this image is a protest against what they called the Vietnamization of San Diego, Stop the Carter plan. Right? Vietnamization meant that the border was a war zone, like Vietnam was not too long ago, right? And they wanted to stop to that, and they thought the proposal to further militarize only further provoked violence. In particular, in the late 70s, children's lives were affected, and this really upset the activists and called for more action. In addition to splitting parents from their kids, having split families in Mexico and the United States that couldn't often see each other, families, their freedom of movement and access to medical care led to the death of 2 children at the border in 1979, I believe. This image by Chicano artist Yolanda Lopez, I think, really pieces together the Raza, Migra, no politics they came up with. It puts it in an image form, right? This is a very famous poster in the Chicano movement, and it persists today. Right? Who's the illegal alien pilgrim? Calling out the moral basis of who has the right, really, to determine who should be here and who shouldn't, especially when the history of this government, as we should know, was one based on genocide and taking land from indigenous people and Mexican people in particular. Right? So this image of an indigenous man asking, he's crushing immigration papers, right? Maybe Carter's immigration papers in particular, and referencing the indigenous roots of Mexican people and the fact that Mexicans actually preceded white Americans in the Southwest, right? So it really attacks the moral basis in which illegal alien, right, is concocted. Yolanda Lopez, she said in relationship to creating this poster, what the Carter proposal did to us as Chicanos and Mexicanos on both sides of the border is we realized our U.S. government looked at its citizens, its Mexican-American citizens, as the enemy. It looked at the Mexicans as a militaristic enemy, and that scared the devil out of us. Again, this called for more action, and an important pinnacle of the book looks at this, a couple of conferences and meetings that happened nationally. The Chicano National Immigration Conference and Memorial March, and the next year, the Chicano National Tribunal, which heard the testimony of dozens of survivors of border patrol violence and other forms of violence coming out of the immigration issue. Within this conference, they evoked the words of the once enslaved abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who of course said, "Power concedes nothing without demand." The Committee on Chicano Rights and its allies at the conference came to define immigration, quote unquote, as the slave issue of the 20th century. Herman Baca, the leader of the CCR, argued, "These same attitudes led to the ultimate degradation of chattel slavery in this country's history. If things continue, we will reach the same point. The so-called immigration issue has been structured also to provide cheap labor so they could be easily exploited at will, and the whole mechanism, just like in the slave system, ensured that people have no right to defend themselves." So again, they're tying immigration to labor, to access of cheap labor. The tribunal, of course, kind of reinforced these ideas and recorded and documented the dozens of moments of violence that occurred and harassment in relationship to enforcing immigration policy. They created a 1,000-page document and sent it to both the presidents of the United States, Ronald Reagan at this time, and the president of Mexico, Jose Lopez Portillo. And this is where they first uttered again and articulated and unpacked what they meant by abolition. This is the end of that march during that conference. Key leaders, Herman Baca, Corky Gonzalez from Colorado, and veteran labor activist who had roots in the 30s, Bert Corona. So what Raza Sin Migrano activists meant by abolition is the following. They tied labor to illegality, right? Immigration, much rather than a system broken, it's actually a system that works quite well in creating an exploitable workforce that certain business interests want to hire, right? In other words, certain business interests want illegal aliens, so-called, right, in order to hire them, in order to use their labor. Again, they evoked the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right, that Mexicans actually preceded the existence of white Americans in the U.S. Southwest, and that should be a way in which Mexicans had certain types of historical rights in the region to roam that region, since they have a historic tie to it. They tied this to a history of racialized labor regimes, again, to slavery, to the Chinese Exclusion Act, to mass deportations of the 30s and the 50s, right? Creating a dialogue with the Black freedom movement, right? Again, the comparison they were making with the slave system. Of course, it's not exactly like the slave system, but its purpose in creating a racialized, exploitable workforce is the evolution of that same process, right, is what they more or less argued. Another important issue that they brought up was U.S. intervention in Latin America and the Third World more broadly. That U.S. foreign policy tended to disrupt societies in the Third World, leading to folks to migrate in the first place, right? So their idea was, if you don't want migrants to come here, then your foreign policy should stop creating migrants, right? Disrupting societies in a way where they have to leave their homes. The policy they proposed was an abolition on all quotas, immigration quotas from countries where the U.S. has political, economic, and military domination. They called for open borders for workers and closed borders for businesses. They called for inclusion of border communities or those most affected in the decision-making process of how to address issues at the border. That was one of their main concerns, is that the folks most affected by these policies at the border weren't included in creating solutions to them. If we really included their perspective and their experiences, then we'd have a very different system. So to conclude, I want to quote Herman Baca again, and on his comparison with the slave system and what the implications of that in relationship to addressing the problems inherent to immigration policy. Baca said, really, when you take the immigration issue and the Afro-American experience, there's a deep parallel The so-called illegal alien immigration issue has been structured also to provide cheap labor so they could be easily exploited at will. And the whole mechanism, just like the slave system, ensured again that people have no right to defend themselves. Building off of the refusal to accept the dehumanizing presence of a militarized border as expressed by migrants, right? Migrants didn't just take that, they always expressed their disdain for that. Activists were pushed to consider that immigration is not simply a policy that can be tweaked and reformed, much rather, not so different than the slave system, they considered it as a system that produces rightless people and that therefore needed to be destroyed. Thank you.
Yes, so I'm myself a student of history. Like I've studied a lot of like European history, warfare, colonization, and all that. I guess one comment I wanted to make was in reference to the southwest of the American continent. Before the Mexican-American War, and even before Mexico's own independence, there were already extensive attempts by the Spanish government, colonial government, to colonize that region, since it was far less populated by their culture. As opposed, like, there are plenty of Native Americans who lived and owned that land before Mexico, before Spain drew a line and said this is ours, and then Mexico became independent from Spain and said, this so happens to be ours also, since we beat Spain for it. The only comment I was making is that Mexico itself, alongside Spain, was already attempting to colonize that land too. Just to say, this to be fair to both sides in that regard. It was land in the midst of colonization, which many countries lost in the Americas during that period. I mean, I don't know if you all know this, but New York used to be New Amsterdam. But the British took it by conquest from the Dutch. It's not a good thing, but it certainly happened a lot.
Sure, that's a great point. Thank you for sharing. In fact, of course, the Spanish did colonize what became the Southwest, right? American cities of Los Angeles, of San Antonio, of Laredo, of Tucson, San Francisco, so on and so forth, were the results of that colonization, which was itself its own kind of racial system and a racial hierarchy that existed. When the U.S. Entered into war with Mexico, of course, Mexico is only 20 or 30 years old, in which Mexico is attempting to abolish those racial kind of hierarchies that existed through Spanish colonization, right? And so it's complicated, right? Because there are mixed race categories. Most Mexicans are mestizos, right? Which was the ideal Mexican, a mixture of Spanish and Indian background, right? The Mexican and Mexican-American claim to being indigenous is what the Chicano movement was proposing, right? A recognition of that part of them that does have ancestors that go back to, of course, the native peoples of the area. That's complicated, right? Chicano studies scholars debate, and American Indian studies scholars debate the kind of issues that come up with that in terms of claiming indigeneity in a place where there are other native peoples, other native nations, right? So it's complicated. And I think that's something I actually, in future work, want to kind of parcel out and unpack a little bit more. So I appreciate the comment. I think in the purposes of the book, recognizing the contradiction that the U.S. had conquered North Mexico and colonized the people there, right? And then calls them foreigners and labels them illegal aliens is at least ironic, if not interesting, right? And if not the root of how we led to this system. So I think for me, their claim of indigeneity was important to point out that contradiction and to defend themselves in a very violent context, right? Even with all the problems and the issues that come up. So yeah, I was going to say something else, but that's one thing that comes up is access to or claiming of indigenous identity was a means through which to protect themselves from day-to-day violence they were experiencing at the hands of this system, right? Yeah. I remember what I was going to say now. There was also dialogue with American Indian peoples. That's something that needs to be unpacked more, the relationship between the Chicano movement and the American Indian movement. The founder of the American Indian movement, AIM, which was actually founded in Minneapolis, where I live now, Dennis Banks, or one of the founders, Dennis Banks, who just passed away a few years ago, was actually present at the conference that I note. So there was dialogue with Native peoples as well that was going on to develop these ideas and these kind of politics. So, thank you. Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, the early chapter actually looks at that. So it's important, I think, as a historian studying this issue, to remember that the notion of illegal alien was invented, right? It was a government bureaucratic kind of concept that was invented. We can point to the date in 1924, right, with the Johnson-Reed Act. The Johnson-Reed Act, of course, kind of invented this concept and then invented the Border Patrol, the United States Border Patrol, as a means to enforce the idea that crossing without getting proper documentation is somehow a crime. Right? It criminalized that process, which before that wasn't necessarily criminalized. Right? A lot of folks, if you have migrant roots that go before that time, it's certainly possible that your ancestors didn't gain documentation the proper way. Right? And so the 24 Act is really important. The book goes through kind of early application of this new policy. Of course, the first application in mass was in the 1930s during the Depression. I want to say 500,000 to 750,000 Mexicans and Mexican Americans are repatriated to the United States. The idea was to clear room for jobs for real Americans. Right? But up to 60% of the people relocated to Mexico were U.S. citizens. So that's one thing I think that we should note, right? Contemporary talk about mass deportation, the U.S. government has done it before. The 30s was the first iteration of it, and the 50s with a policy called Operation Wetback, and yes, that's what the official name was. The Border Patrol claimed to have deported 1 million people in 1954. Both times, more than half of the people relocated were U.S. citizens, most of them children of migrants. And so that's one kind of thing we should note in terms of how history teaches us these mass deportation kind of occurrences, what they provoke, the kind of human rights violations that inherently happen with these things. So many of the activists who defended the rights of migrants and Mexican Americans in that context. Bert Corona, again, was one of them. Actually kind of learned and put it on the agenda that part of Mexican American civil rights was to address the unequal way that the immigration system treats that particular community. And so they really mentored the 1960s and 70s generation of activists who were addressing it again in a new context, post-1970s into the 1980s, when the undocumented population really expands. And so more moments of violence and harassment occur because more folks are coming, and the policy's reaction to it is law enforcement, which equals violent confrontations. So yeah, I think that's a little bit on that. Yeah, thank you. Sure, good question. I think it's a historian's term. I think it's a scholarship term that I'm referencing May Nai's book, Impossible Subjects, where she looks at this moment of the 1920s and the invention of the concept of illegal alien. And what she argues is a fundamental reshaping of American society based on who's an illegal immigrant and who's not, right? To affirm kind of citizenship, there has to be a non-citizen. she argues. And this is a new way society is set up. So that's what regime is referring to, is that it's deportation focused. Immigration policy can be a number of things and go in a number of directions. But at this moment in the 20s, and I think we're still in the moment, the government decided to concentrate its immigration policy in terms of law enforcement, and in terms of enforcing the removal of individuals who they criminalize through this notion of illegal alien, right? And even still with the criminalization of crossing borders without documents, it's still a misdemeanor, right? So it's interesting to think about the militarization and the resources put into enforcing that law. It's the equivalent of a traffic ticket, right? Because it's a misdemeanor. So it's interesting how that's built up upon, and really in the past 30 years, I think, has kind of mass resources be put into this regime, right? Based on deportation. In many ways, I think in dialogue with folks who argue about policing and the rise of the prison regime, post-civil rights, law enforcement generally became kind of the go-to solution to social problems. So rather than programs or welfare or education or other things that can engineer society, law enforcement was turned to, in many ways, as a reaction to the civil rights movement. That's what a lot of folks are arguing now. It was a way of repressing the demands of the civil rights movement, was to reinforce and invest more in prisons and law enforcement as the primary way to solve social problems. Last I looked, $6 billion goes to border policing, right? And so that's a question we should ask, is what does that go to? Again, the Border Patrol, ICE, and Homeland Security is arguing that it's for safety. From the perspective of these folks, it does quite the opposite to their community. It provokes violence against their communities. And that's something that they determine they can't compromise, right? And so, yeah, so that term helps us, I think, talk about that in all these kind of different ways.
I read a book for this semester for my government classes about Jose Gutierrez. It's how the making of a civil rights leader. So I really got my attention about the Chicano movement and how things were back in the 1960s here in Texas, and how schools were segregated, and how Hispanic always be the minority, even though that for many of the Chicano population have been born in here, they have U.S. citizenship and everything. What I really like about the book is about all these movements that have been happening since 1960 for civil rights movements for Hispanic students. But I can still feel like the school, even though we have been far from those times, I think still feel like the school is still kind of neglecting Hispanic speaker students. Because on my personal experience, I want to be a nurse. So sometimes whenever I go to the nursing program, I just see white faces. Sure. And it's kind of get my attention. And reading all these books, I kind of feel like, yeah, we moved far from those times, but still so much to do. And it's just, it also get my attention that people nowadays, they don't care about like getting in a group and fighting for a couch. They more worry about being on Facebook, Instagram, than having something to fight for, which is something that we need to do, because if we don't do it right now, I don't know what world we're going to be later on.
Sure, absolutely. No, thank you for your comments. I always begin all my classes with just a rundown of the current existence of racial inequality and other forms of inequality. I mean, it's not hard to see, right? The government collects data on education levels, on wealth, on income, employment, health, prison statistics, who's more likely to go to prison and who's not. Race always determines, in the intersection with other things, right? Always determines who has better life chances. Today, right here, 2019, right? So I think that's important. I think that's exactly why we need to study the past, particularly the civil rights movement that attempted to solve these problems, and why they didn't, because they didn't solve the problems, but they're still here. Although we have spaces where we can struggle, right? I'm in a Chicano Latino Studies department. We're about to celebrate our 50th anniversary in 2 years, so it's directly tied to these movements that created that space so that we can try to teach and learn and do something about these situations. But I think what you bring up is it's challenging, and I think these activists were attempting to kind of solve these problems, tying it to, of course, what they were initially battling was segregation, was the experience of those folks of color with citizenship who were experiencing a form of second-class citizenship, right? And so what that, and kind of they were trying to solve those problems and stumbled upon this other overlapping problem in relationship to immigration and the violence that was coming from that. That was really the argument of these Chicano movement activists, is like, we want to get to a point where we're voting out folks who are against our interest, that we're voting as a bloc, that we understand what our interests are, that we're participating in all the institutions that exist in this society in a way that to make change, right? But now we need to address this issue first, because a third to a half of our people aren't eligible to vote. And we're recognizing that actually there's a system that kind of reproduces that, right? That withholds citizenship from certain folks. And so that's why they stumbled upon the immigration issue as related to these other experiences of second-class citizenship, which really leads to kind of tough questions about, so the immigrant rights movement focuses on gaining a pathway to citizenship, right? That's one of their solutions. That's one of the ways that migrants will have better standing, will be able to participate in society more, to have less fear around being separated from their loved ones, so on and so forth. But ask, Mexican Americans with citizenship, or ask the African American community what their experience of citizenship has been. And that doesn't solve all the problems, right? Those folks, the Treaty of Guadalupe gave Mexican American citizens in 1848. Of course, African Americans have a citizen since the 1860s. And we're still in a moment where blackness and brownness kind of affects your life chances in the society. So we need to have a larger conversation about what is the solution. It can't be just citizenship, because many of us have citizenship, but it's not practiced. So what is at the root of that, and what are the solutions to that, right? And I think one of the solutions that I learned from writing this book to that situation is for oppressed communities, like you're saying, to come together and begin to, in their own experiences and independently, determine what their problems are as a collective, as a group of people, and attempt to solve those problems as a collective, right? Starting with the local, right? But that ties to all these global and national issues at the same time. So that's a big question, but I appreciate it.
So I have one question. Early on, one of the two things you started off your talk with was that we already have open borders. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Mexican immigrants, in particular, Asian migrants, immigrant labor from Europe, right, has been a fundamental, permanent fixture of the American economy since at least the 19th century, right? Those are forms of open borders, right? People crossing borders to get here. That's been exacerbated or expanded in the past 25, 30 years with globalization, as we call it, right? NAFTA, CAFTA, these global trade kind of arrangements. Those are open borders. Those are open borders for capital, right? Those are open borders for businesses to locate in Mexico or Taiwan or China or wherever. But there's often the open borders that accesses migrant labor in the United States, again, which is a more than 100-year kind of, event. does it in a way that subordinates these folks and subjects them to certain forms of violence and control, right? So instead of being, there's 12 million undocumented folks here, right? The borders are open. Those folks are here. They were often recruited here to work here, right? And so the question is not this fear around, oh, they're going to come and do these bad things, right? The question is, what kind of open borders do we want? Because the kind of open borders we have now, from the perspective of these folks, is that they experience violence, subordination, harassment, family separation. Now we have children in cages, so on and so forth. That's the type of open borders we have now. Folks can come here, folks cross borders, but then they're subject to this incarceration system that's emerged. So again, I think Mexican labor in particular has been part of the American economy since the late 19th century, right? It's about being forthright with that. I think the debate over open borders or not really distracts us from that reality, that this is a permanent part of our economy, right? These folks are working in every industry that we use and think of, right? You go to the grocery store, you go to a restaurant, you go to a hotel, you go wherever, construction, the buildings that are around us, right? Immigrant labor was part and parcel of all those things. And so the borders are open for that phenomenon to happen. How can we restructure it to cover these people's rights, right? Sure. Great question. And I think in the book I explore the way activists turn to Mexico as well to participate in solving the problem. I think one solution that they addressed that addressed both countries was, again, to recognize the reality that the economies are shared between those two countries. The economies overlap between those, like I said, businesses have been going there, back and forth, and labor has particularly been coming here. We can talk about American tourism in Mexico. Americans go to Mexico often for that kind of vacations and tourism and whatnot, which is an important part of their economy there, right? So I think both countries need to come to the table and admit or recognize formally that they share an economy with one another. From the perspective of these activists, they wanted a recognition of that shared economy so that workers could more easily unionize. Many of these folks come out of the labor movement and saw trade unions as a way in which to gain workers' rights, to maintain and increase wages, right? So that employers didn't have the option of hiring someone for $5 versus someone for $15, right? Often the immigrant is blamed for that circumstance in certain rhetoric, right? That's the employer's decision to choose one over the other, right? And so the labor movement in its best iterations, I think, sought to incorporate undocumented folks and immigrant folks into in their unions in order to address that problem. The challenge with, I think the two governments, it's important that they recognize that it's hard to think about in this moment that coming to iteration. And to be frank, the Mexican government also has often failed to protect its citizens in relationship to the reality that they were coming here for work, right? Many of the activists went to Mexico to gain support and approval and spread the kind of idea and call for help from the Mexican people in different ways. And came to find out, at least in the late 70s and the early 80s, in Mexico, often these folks leaving were seen as traitors to some degree, that they were leaving their country, they were leaving the patria, right? And so that kind of ideological work needed to be done in Mexico too, to recognize that these folks, have human rights. So the concern in Latino studies around this issue is that there's this floating kind of workforce that doesn't have a state to protect them, right? And hopefully shifts in the government in Mexico more recently may address some of those issues. For the first time, it has a a leftist president in decades, right, that has put this on the agenda in certain ways. But, you know, again, it'd be interesting in how that perspective clashes with the priorities of this administration in the U.S. So, but yeah, it undoubtedly is a regional North American issue that needs to be handled as such. So, thank you.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. So, yes. And then.
Earlier when you were discussing deportation, you mentioned that people that looked like they were legal immigrants could be like arrested and deported. Some friends that have like Mexican ancestry, but they don't look like the stereotypical Mexican. So how do they know that they fit the look of being an illegal immigrant?
Yeah, I think you're referring to the specific policy of the taxi cab memorandum, and that's why, you know, Mexicans of course look, you know, a diversity of ways, right? But I think that's the racialization of a people, is to imagine that they look like one thing, right? And so, so like brownness, looking brown, like the color of your skin is what marks you as illegal. That's why illegal alien, that scholars have argued, is a racializing term, right? Because we think of that and we think of something, right? We think of what one looks like, right? And that matches, again, colorism, one's kind of color. And in many ways, that's what these activists were up against, were not only this memorandum, which was telling taxi cab drivers to call the police to anybody that looked illegal, which what they ended up doing is they didn't pick up brown people. That's how the activists found out about it. Brown folks couldn't catch a cab because the cab drivers were so afraid of getting in trouble for picking up a so-called illegal, right, that they wouldn't pick up anybody that looked brown. Right? So that's how that tends to get interpreted, right? So if you're light-skinned and you happen to be Mexican, you may pass. You know, you may not be subject to that same treatment because there's this set idea of what it is. And that came up in a number of circumstances over and over again. Early in California passed a law that would actually punish employers for hiring undocumented folks. Well, there's documentation that what happened was employers stopped hiring anybody Mexican or Mexican American, anybody that looked Mexican. So the civil rights movement criticized it from that perspective. Late in the 70s, it went to the Supreme Court whether inland border checkpoints were legal, right? And the Supreme Court said they were, right? But the argument was that it was legalized racial profiling. Of course, in San Diego, there's an inland checkpoint in Orange County, right? And in Texas, I don't remember where they are, but growing up, when we go to Mexico, we would have to cross them several times. And we'd get nervous, right? You'd get certain folks experience the anxiety of being profiled because it's legal and it's practiced. It's part of immigration policy, right? So, yeah, that's a lot of what they were criticizing. And that's a lot of how Mexican Americans came to take it up as part of a civil rights agenda, because it was affecting American citizens too. Which wasn't necessarily, I should say, that wasn't necessarily always the case, right? Mexican Americans often conflicted with Mexican immigrants. And certain groups tried to distance themselves from immigrants, right? So this was a particular phenomenon that I studied of folks who identified with them and advocated for them. That was in a context in which the community didn't agree on how to approach that. And you know, we can talk about this appeal or this attempt to access whiteness, right? We're not them, and this is how we're not them. We're not the degraded kind of group of people. We're this other group of people, right?
I think that the book does a fantastic job of repositioning, right? Roles responsible for creating this dilemma. You guys said something about the broken immigration system actually working quite well, right? In that it was successful and is successful in creating an exploitable labor force, workforce, right? that serves the interests of some of the most powerful agricultural firms in the country. So here's my question, right? How come why isn't there terms of blame? Why don't I ever hear persons go after these agricultural firms? Why do I hear the problem being the exploitable workforce population? Why do you think that is? Why do you think that we blame the workers, but we don't ever blame the owners?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I think it gets to the heart of the problem. And I think, well, one thing I think is that the interest group that wants undocumented labor is very powerful. So I think that's why I like to reiterate how the immigration system's not broken, it's just exploitative. Because that really gets us to grapple with the problem in reality. The problem is really there's a very powerful group of interest that want it just like it is, that are benefiting from it. So now today it's not just agriculture, it's the tourist industry, it's the restaurant industry, it's the construction industry. That's expanded actually in terms of the industries that rely on immigrant labor. So I think those interests are very successful at redirecting the conversation towards the workers rather than the people hiring them. I think they just have a lot of power, and the way that the debate is framed fails to recognize that reality, and that's, I think, a product of the power of these interest groups to influence folks in both parties. That's why the debate is very narrow in terms of Democrats are for a little bit of amnesty and militarization, and Republicans are for militarization. That's why I hope the book intervenes in that very convoluted frame of debate, because from their perspective, militarization is common sense, and law enforcement is common sense in the current debate, and it has been for a couple of generations now, in both parties, right? If we see the Democratic Party now trying to sign this bill with the president, they agree with certain types of militarization. They gave several millions and billions of dollars to further militarization, right? That's why Carter, a liberal Democrat, is the main kind of one of the protagonists or one of the targets of the movement in his attempt to militarize. So I think, yeah, I hope this perspective intervenes, because, again, law enforcement and militarization that targets the worker is not something that the community can really compromise on. Your safety is not something to compromise on, and unfortunately, we don't hear that perspective often, because the debate has been framed in a certain kind of way because the power of these interest groups and the inability of the media to widen that debate to include more voices. But yeah, great question. Thank you.
Okay, I actually have a question here, or a comment, and that is, I think that Chomsky in her book Undocumented How Immigration Became Illegal, she surveys the literature on undocumented workers worldwide, and she finds this pattern, and that is whether you're talking about Saudi Arabia, or Japan, or Russia, or even China today, these economies need undocumented workers because they are easily exploitable. But then there's something else. What she finds is that these nations that have strong economy, they also need undocumented workers because they are a very convenient scapegoat in times of political, social, economic distress. In other words, she's saying, hey, we need undocumented people because we're going to need to blame somebody. We need somebody to blame instead of acknowledging that there's a real problem. So I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. No, thank you for mentioning that. I was going to mention also, I think that helps answer the question, is that there's also political capital in blaming immigrants and saying that you're going to do something about a problem in society through scapegoating immigrants, right? And so that has expanded. If you ever get a chance, Google the 1980 Republican presidential debate between George H. Bush and Ronald Reagan. And my students are always just floored that they were arguing with each other about who could be kinder to immigrants, right? And not that I'm a big fan of George Bush or Ronald Reagan, but it shows the shift in the Republican Party to this extreme position on immigration, right? And so that is related to how immigration became political capital as a means of getting elected, a means of gaining state power in different ways. And that's another reason I think that the perspective of workers and migrants themselves gets subsumed. So great point. Thank you for bringing that up, Juan. Yeah, my formative years when I was in community college at Montgomery College, I took a few classes at North Harris. My nephew's actually here, and he's taken some classes there. My dad took classes there. It was an important formative moment, and where I started to think about these things and put my experiences into ideas, right? So the book came out of that experience for sure. So it's really cool to share the book with this community. So I appreciate it.